Malware, or pronounced malware if you're a nearly washed up Hollywood actor resurrecting his career in the latest overnight cult classic TV series. Malware is a term that not so long ago was itself just a made up word not to be found in dictionaries or academic texts, yet a budding vernacular poised to take its place in both techie and mainstream linguistic history. Today, anyone in the internet-connected world knows the term, as it either strikes fear in the average day-to-day netizen, or it means job security to cybersecurity professionals everywhere. As fascinating of a history and story that malware has, believe it or not, that's not our topic today. Instead, we're interested in the mysterious neo-dualistic art and science of naming malware. Choosing not to go in the direction of biological viruses, our modern technical threat hunters don't bore us with complex conjunctions of the Latin language and alphanumeric code. Okay, sure, we've all seen the laundry lists of viruses that could pass for a techno CDC watch list, but the true masters of the art, those that have no use for such cumbersome naming conventions, this is their story. With a few exceptions, early viruses were relatively harmless and not quite as destructive as some of their Hollywood counterparts would have you think. When asked about the first ever documented computer viruses in history, many people often refer to either the famous Morris worm, named after creator Robert Morris, or the ping pong virus, named for the annoying little ball that bounces across the screen, constantly, forever. However, both the Morris worm and the ping pong virus were released in 1988. The first documented malicious program was actually released in 1974. In fact, the actual term computer virus wasn't even coined until 1983, so the first quote-unquote virus was simply called the Rabbit or Wabbit, which was more of just a fork bomb than a true virus, but still malicious in nature. It was aptly named Rabbit for the speed at which it did its job. It made multiple copies of itself on a single computer until it used up all available memory, reducing system performance before finally reaching a threshold and crashing the computer. Coincidentally, the Rabbit made a cameo in the very same scene of the 1995 film Hackers that we just saw a few moments ago. As far as malware naming is concerned, the 1970s and 80s remained much of the same. Simple labels, usually based on their relatively basic functionality, where they were found, the systems they affected, or sometimes just named after their creator. And for the most part, malware functionality remained little more than annoying, doing things like causing words to fall off the screen, spreading rapidly, depleting resources, or maybe subverting password protection mechanisms, which would have been one of the biggest threats of the time. However, in 1989, came one pretty big exception. The AIDS Trojan became the world's first known ransomware, named so due to the disks claiming to contain information on the AIDS virus, the actual biological version. Several thousand floppy disks containing the AIDS Trojan were mailed to subscribers of PC Business World magazine and a WHO AIDS conference mailing list. This denial-of-service Trojan would lie dormant for 90 boot cycles, then encrypt all file names on the system, displaying a notice asking for $189 to be sent to a post office box in Panama in order to receive a decryption program. The early to mid-90s brought the advent of polymorphic and macro viruses, but not much changed in terms of naming conventions, except for one possible shining glimpse of brilliance. In 1992, we were introduced to the Michelangelo virus. Why is this so significant? The Michelangelo virus was expected to create a digital apocalypse on March 6th, with millions of computers having their information wiped, according to the mass media hysteria surrounding the virus. Well, that obviously didn't happen, and that's not the potential brilliance I was referring to. The brilliance was in the name. Every year, the virus remained dormant until March 6th, which happens to be the birthday of the famous Renaissance artist Michelangelo. But the virus made no mention of Michelangelo and had no other relevance to Michelangelo as far as anyone could tell. So, why choose Michelangelo's birthday? Or why choose a birthday at all for that matter? As far as we know, it could have been the day that the virus creator's goldfish died, or lost their first tooth, or the creator's own birthday. As far as birthdays go, there are a lot of famous people with March 6th birthdays. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Lou Costello from Abbott and Costello, Mary Wilson of the Supremes, David Gilmour of Pink Floyd, and, well, Tom Arnold. We could have had a Stop in the Name of the Love virus or Tom Arnold virus. But no, the true artist that named this virus, whether it was the media, an antivirus company, or a lone threat hunter, in a moment of pure clarity and potential genius, chose the name, the only name that would enshrine it in history forever: the Michelangelo virus. And in doing so, little did anyone know the once mundane malware naming convention could be approaching the dawn of a new era. Right at the turn of the millennia, and with both the internet and Silicon Valley booming, and Y2K looming in the shadows, malware seemed to be becoming a weapon of techno-nastiness. Due to the increasing proliferation of malware, antivirus companies were still quite clinical with many of their day-to-day signature names. But over time, we'd begin to see those artistic souls that are willing to challenge the status quo. In 1999, David L. Smith was sentenced to 10 years in prison for releasing the Melissa virus, which he actually named after a stripper he met in Miami South Beach. Not quite the elegance of Michelangelo, but I'm giving this one 5 stars for style. You might be thinking, what about the I Love You virus or the Anna Kournikova virus? While they might seem like clever names, they were just named according to the attachments contained in the emails they were spread by. 2001 was the year of the infamous Code Red Worm, an iconic name that will echo throughout the IT halls for decades. But why the name Code Red? EI Digital Security employees Mark Mayfret and Ryan Permay named it Code Red because Code Red Mountain Dew was what they were drinking at the time. Well played, fellas. Well played. By the mid-2000s, the common virus was all but a thing of the past, and worms were all the new rage. With the increased number of malware and an all-star cast of famous names to dive into, I was certain that my research would turn up some of the most creative naming conventions to date. Unfortunately, this just wasn't the case. Even with the famous worms like SQL Slammer, Blaster, Welchia, Sasser, Zotob, and even My Doom, I turned up nothing more than what I had a decade before. Simple names based on function or target, or bearing bits of variations of code or a file or message found within. That is, until mid-2006. The Stardust virus, also known as the Starbucks virus, which attacks the Star Office suite. Not quite strippers, Mountain Dew, and Renaissance men, but at least it's headed in the right direction. It wasn't until the release of Configure in 2008 that I would start to see the level of creativity and artistry displayed in some of the earlier historical gems. Now, Configure is a true neologism, created by 2 separate words and from 2 different languages. The English word configure and a German word that, well, translates to an expletive. I'll leave that one for you to look up on your own, but the basic gist is it screws up your configuration. As my research moved toward much more modern malware, I had high hopes for Stuxnet. I was highly disappointed. Symantec derives Stuxnet's name from a combination of keywords in the software .stub and mrxnet.sys. Even the Stuxnet descendant Dooku got its name from the prefix DQ that it gives to the names of the files it creates. Another dead end, because as a Star Wars fan, I had really high hopes. It really wasn't until the last few years that malware naming really began to break away from the traditional convention. But it didn't start with the actual malware itself, but rather the larger campaign behind the malware. In 2014, my inner sci-fi nerd was ecstatic when Eyesight Partners, now a subsidiary of FireEye, announced the discovery of Sandworm. Just as I had hoped, the name apparently had nothing to do with the inner workings of the malware or messages found in the code. This was pure, unadulterated sci-fi geekdom at its best. The name was dramatically borrowed from the famous 1960s science fiction epic Dune, and this malware campaign even had its own logo, which would eventually lead to swag you could purchase at hacker conferences. That same year, A campaign using the Havix malware was given 2 different names by 2 different cybersecurity firms. The campaign was either called Dragonfly or Energetic Bear, depending on which report you read. What's really interesting about the name Energetic Bear is that it suggested that some firms were now willing to use a hint of attribution in the naming convention. In this case, the use of the term bear was a correlation to the fact that cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike attributed the campaign to a Russian intelligence agency. One interesting aspect to this new shift in naming convention is that they all tend to focus on industrial systems like SCADA and the electric power grid, so it's only fitting that the next discovery was called Black Energy, which was related to the first Ukraine blackout in 2015. Black Energy sounded like a name to be reckoned with. And I was starting to get the sense that the industrial threat hunters were onto something. By this point, it was pretty clear that there was a true change in naming convention. So, not to be outdone was the vulnerability research community. I mean, after all, why let the threat hunters have all the fun, right? Heartbleed and Shell Shock weren't campaigns or malware at all. They were software bugs. But who's afraid of CVE 2014-0160 or OpenSSL and properly handled heartbeat extension packets buffer overflow? Nah, Heartbleed. That scares the crap out of me. I don't care what it does. Speaking of scary, malware naming was now on top of its game. In 2017, the WannaCry ransomware dropped. I can't think of a better way to get the point across than with a name that in no uncertain terms basically says, "This is some bad shit." In another attack on Ukraine's power grid, Slovak internet security company ESET named the responsible malware framework Indestroyer. Now, in a day and age where malware naming convention is finally starting to look less like a clinical study and more like a cast of anime baddies, I give Indestroyer 5 stars for a perfect blend of creativity and appropriate cheesiness. This is a true neologism. But cybersecurity firm Dragos founder and CEO Rob Lee said, Crash Override. Why? I didn't even bother to ask. I'm too scared that any explanation would tarnish my preconceived fantasy that the real reason is just beyond words. Well played, sir. Well played. In late 2017, malware naming creativity appeared to take a slight hit with a new campaign that targets Triconic Safety Instrumented Systems, or SIS, controllers. FireEye named the malware Triton. Not too bad, but it is just a little too close to the old conventions for my liking. But then, Rob Lee once again stepped in with another Dragos override, see what I did there? And called it Trisis. Wait, what? That seems even more of a throwback to the old, obvious ways. But upon further analysis of Dragos' report, we see that the victim was an industrial asset owner in the Middle East. Ah, Trisis. I see what you did there. Careful, Rob. That could be presumed to be flirting with attribution, but well played, again. But wait, there's more. DHS NCCIC, assuming the responsibilities of the former ICS cert in its first official release, boldly trumped Triton and Trisis by declaring it Hatman. Why? I don't need to know why. Because the best mysteries of all time have always involved a faceless, creepy stranger wearing a hat. But more importantly, this new sheriff in town, the DHS NCCIC, by throwing their name into the hat for this game started more than 3 decades ago, has seemingly endorsed this new paradigm of creative malware naming convention. And I, for one, can't wait to see where it leads. Let the games begin.